Welcome to Learning Photography with Duck. Here's your host, Duck.
All right, welcome once again to another edition of Learn Photography with Duck. I am, as always, your host, and I got, there we go, Photoshop edition. I am your host, Duck, and today is Photoshop edition. So we'll be going over some Photoshop stuff today. I want to welcome everybody. We got some new people in today. Today's topic, we're going to go a little bit to some fundamentals today. Today's topic comes from Pallavi, who asked me to cover a little bit about Photoshop workflow. All right, so for that, I'm going to dip a toe into Lightroom as well. And then I'm going to go through a complete edit on a landscape photo that's, in my archive, because I know a lot of you are into landscape. For those of you who are portrait photographers, people photographers, event photographers, a lot of these lessons will apply to you. So just, even though the subject matter I'm editing may not be what you normally shoot, trust me, the fundamentals apply pretty much across the board. All right, so without further ado, Pallavi asked if I could kind of sort of explain a little bit about Photoshop workflow. And I can sympathize with her because when you're first starting to learn how to edit, I know for me, one of the resources that I went to is, of course, YouTube. And the problem with YouTube is that they give you little chunks, because obviously Photoshop is this monster of a program that there's multiple ways of doing the exact same thing. And then, of course, to edit an image from beginning to end requires a lot of different tools, for you to understand. So obviously, if we were to package all that into a single video, you're talking about 3 to 5 hours just to explain everything. So of course, the YouTubers, they break it down into little bits and pieces. You learn a particular tool or you learn a particular technique, and then it kind of leaves you in the air as to, well, how do I piece all these little lessons together? Where does it fit? And more importantly, what I found out as I got more involved with Photoshop and learning how to edit is that in the real world, as you are editing, there are the parts in between all these lessons that you learn that you're kind of like wondering, it's okay, where do I go next? What do I do next? All right, so there tends to be a lesson, then a gap, then another lesson, then another gap, then another lesson and a gap, and so on. So it's like, it brings up a lot of hesitation with your editing. It's like, am I doing this right? Do I got these things in the right order? What am I missing? So hopefully, we'll kind of dispel a little bit of that apprehension for you today. And I'll explain a couple of little tools that I feel are the most useful, and then walk through a workflow. And then if at any point anybody has any questions, as always, please feel free to just raise or just call it out. Let me go ahead and share screen. Where's my screen? Share. Okay. And everybody sees that. Okay, good. All right. Okay. What we're going to do. Yeah.
We were seeing your screen and now we don't, unless everybody else sees the screen.
You should see me, and it should say Photoshop Edition here. You see the half screen? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. And everybody else should kind of like disappear. You don't need to see anybody, especially Big Al, because he's all blurry. I'm going to pick on you today, Al. We also have an Alan that joins the group, so I guess Al and Alan kind of, you know, makes it a little bit easier for everybody, right?
There's three of us. There's actually three of us.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. There is, but last name of Alan. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Which he joined us on our latest photo shoot. I was going to, this is how prepared I am today. I was going to actually edit a few of those images from this past photo walk, but I left them home. So rather than rush home to try to beat the clock, I said, next time. All right, so here's my desktop. As you guys know, I tend to prefer starting my workflow in Lightroom because Lightroom and Photoshop share the same raw processing engine. Lightroom is, of course, Lightroom Edit or Lightroom Develop, and Photoshop is Adobe Camera Raw. And if you put those two side by side, you're going to see that they're slider for slider, they're identical. Okay. So if you are not particularly fond of Lightroom, which aghast, I don't know why, because it's a great image cataloging resource. All right. But if for some reason you feel Lightroom's not your thing, you don't want to do it, the things that I'm going to be showing you here in Lightroom can also be done in Adobe Camera Raw. All right. And I'm going to edit this particular image in a couple of ways, again, just to show you that there's multiple ways of getting to the end result. Okay. So this is my image. I would say straight out of camera, but actually it's not. This is a composite. It's a panorama of two images that I took at our local park here of this train trestle. All right, and the way I like to teach photo editing is look at the image and try to identify the things that are obviously wrong with the image. What really jumps out at you, okay? So, of course, a lot of people who are beginning say, well, you know, my eye really hasn't been trained enough to really be able to discern some of the nuances, all right? But that's okay. Disregard the nuances and just go with the more obvious things. All right. So looking at this, what are some of the obvious problems with this image? Okay. Well, one of the first things that really jumps out is that we have this rather bland, blah sky. It's gray. It's no texture, no clouds, no color, nothing to it. Okay. So I would say there's, you know, one thing to put on our list of things to tackle. The second one is there's a question here as to what the subject matter is. All right. And, you know, we can say, well, you know, we got this nice scene here and we see this train trestle right smack literally in the center of the image. So it is assumed, based on just placement alone in the composition, that this might be the subject. But there's also this little path to the side that kind of just pulls my attention over there. And I want to explore that little area. Okay, so we have, let's see, here we go. Oh, wait a minute, wait a minute. What do we do? My drawing tool is not, there we go, here we go. All right, so we have our sky, all right, that's too light, okay. We have our train trestle, is that the subject, all right, but our eye is being pulled to this, all right, asking, is this important, okay, is that important? All right, so if we break it down, let's go back to some of the fundamentals of how we view an image. All right, by default, here in the West, we read top to bottom, left to right. Okay, so we're being pulled in immediately into this image across the top because this also happens to be the brightest part of the image. And that's one of the things that we tend to do is look for what's the brightest parts of an image. Okay. And then from there, we want to travel down. But we're hitting a few walls here as we travel downward. All right, because there is no clear indicator of, yes, this is your subject. Okay. The other thing I want to touch on today is part of the lessons that I've done in the past with my 3-tone rules of composition. For those of you who've never seen or don't understand what I'm talking about, is that if we can simplify a composition as far as editing it into 3 tones of light, midtones, and darks, and how we arrange those in a cohesive fashion where they kind of balance in order for our eye to travel to the given subject. All right, whether the subject is the brightest part against a darker background, which tends to be kind of like the go-to that a lot of people try to work for. But there's also other conventions is where you can have the subject be the darkest part against a very light background. Okay, and you'll find that in images that are considered high key, where the majority of the image is very, very light. And let's say you have a subject that has dark hair. The dark kind of floats in this sea of lightness, and therefore you have this contrast of light and dark. And because the dark is so dominant, that becomes your subject focus. Okay. All right, so we're going to play around a little bit of that here with this particular image. Because if we look at it, we have this wall of trees here that extends pretty much across, all right, except for this area here, okay? So we have all this texture of greenery, all right? And there's no differentiation between each of these elements. But if we look at the actual physical composition, the actual placement of where each element resides in the physical space, okay, because after all, we are taking a photograph of an actual 3-dimensional space that we were in. It's just that it's compressed into 2 dimensions, all right? But we can see that we have the far bank of a river, and then we have the near bank of the river. All right. And even though we don't see it, we understand that that bridge crosses over a river. So with that knowledge, we know that this set of trees here is on the far bank, and these bushes and this set of trees are on the near bank. Okay, makes sense? Fairly easy to follow so far. All right, Once we have that delineation, we can say, all right, that gives us something to play with. That gives us these little borders that we can manipulate our light. Okay, and that's exactly what we're going to do. All right, so we've identified the sky. We've identified that the texture is a little bit too consistent all the way around, all the way across the image. We've identified that we don't have a strong subject, and we also identified that we have that little path off to the right-hand side that's kind of pulling our attention. All right, so that's 5 things right off the bat. All right, so what I want you to do is give yourself this little mental exercise and ask yourself, okay, did I subconsciously pick any of those out when I initially saw the image? All right, or am I pointing out something that was like, wow, now that you pointed out, that's very obvious? All right, and just be truthful to yourself, because this is all part of the training of how to train your eye to analyze and break down an image for editing. Okay. Now, obviously, there are more than one way to edit an image. I'm just going with, the first things that really jump out at me, and I'm going to experiment with this edit process. Okay. All right. So now that we've identified 5 things, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what are the tools that are going to allow me to, quote unquote, fix these problems? Okay. And the one thing that we can analyze and look at and says, you know what? The majority of those problems can be distilled down to one core issue. And that is the interaction of light on the different parts. Okay? The lighting on the different parts. So what do I mean by this? Well, we've already identified the first one, which is, like I said, the most obvious, is that our sky, all right, is too light. It's overexposed. Okay? And we notice that the train trestle, I wouldn't say it's underexposed. Okay? But as a whole, in relation to everything around it, it is rather dark, and it can go a little bit brighter. Okay, so we can see that, all right, we have an overexposed sky, and we have a ever so slightly underexposed train trestle. Okay, again, this is subjective, because in reality, we can look at it and say, no, the train trestle is properly exposed. I see, shadow detail in there. I can make out all the crossbars of the bridge, and in relation to the tree line, it looks appropriate to the tree line. Okay, but what I want you to understand here is that we're going to be working on training your eye to look at some subtleties. And eventually you'll play the what if game. All right. So what if I lower the exposure on the sky? How will the rest of the image look? All right. Is it going to look like it matches that sky, or is it going to look like it's a little bit out of balance for that darker sky? Because right now we're looking at an overall exposure for the entire image. Okay, and I'll tell you what I mean. Okay. All right, so we have an overexposed sky. We have a slightly underexposed train trestle. Okay. And we notice that as our eye travels from this spot here of the trees across to this spot here of the trees, we're going from a slightly brighter green to a slightly darker green. Okay. All right. So, and this is just something that's naturally happening because what you are not able to see from this image that over on the side outside of my frame is additional trees that are creating a lot of shadow in this area here. Okay. While this area here is across the river, so there's a span of emptiness that allows the sun to really hit that tree line a little bit more. All right, so when we see that, we can say, you know what? That gives us something to play with. That gives us something to play with. And what I mean by that is that we can break this down into 3, maybe even 4 zones. All right, so what do I mean by zones? Zones are areas of luminosity that fit within a certain realm. All right, and in Lightroom, we actually have 5 zones. We've gone over this last time. And the zones are represented right here. Okay, we have our exposure, our highlights, our shadows, our whites, and our blacks. So we have 5 zones. Everything from pure white to pure black. Okay. So now we can look at it and it says, okay, well, the sky up here is in our whites. All right. And we have some areas that are in the blacks. Okay. This little here is in the blacks. Okay. We have areas that are in shadow. All right. Like here and here. And then we have a lot of areas that are in our midtones. So we have midtones here. We have midtones here. We definitely have midtones here. All right. We have, we could even say this is a little bit more on the lighter side of midtones. It's kind of pushing the boundary there. All right. So once we understand where all these sections lay within our exposure range, we can then start identifying how we want to manipulate that light. All right, so obviously this area up here with our whites, we want to bring the exposure down. The area with our blacks, we might want to push the exposure up, make it a little bit brighter. All right, and this is just me kind of thinking out loud, problem solving before I actually get to making any manipulations. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm creating a roadmap of how I want to take my image from the raw image to the processed image. Okay. All right, so these areas in shadows, I might want to bring them up to meet more of my midtone, but my midtones is adjacent to the whites. All right, so I want you to follow me on this. All right, between the whites and the midtones, we have our highlights. Okay, so if we look in, where are we? If we look way over there to our histogram, right, to our histogram, we see that all the way to the right is our whites. Right next to that is our lights. And then we have a section here, which is our mid-tones. All right. And again, we covered this last week, so you should be familiar with it. For those of you who are new, these sessions do get uploaded to my YouTube channel. So you can go to YouTube, Learn Photography with Duck, and you can always review this lesson and, of course, refer back to previous ones. Okay. So we have midtones, which is right here. And we have our whites, which is right here. All right. So that means we have the lights or highlights that are in between this area. So if we are bringing our whites down, we want to bring the whites from the whites into our highlights. All right, so we're going to be bringing this down. All right, so therefore, what I want to do in order to balance it a little bit more, I feel I will need to bring my midtones a little closer to the highlights. Okay, because I am also raising my shadows as well. Okay, so there's going to be a push and a pull every time you move one of these sliders. So if I push my shadows up, all right, if I, excuse me, let me rephrase that. If I move my shadow slider up to add more light, it's going to push the midtones and it's going to pull the blacks. Okay. So there's going to be this shift of lightening across three of those zones. Right. Now in the shadow area off to the right-hand side here, I think, and this is just me kind of second guessing it, I think I might want to keep those about there. All right. Once I adjust the other parts, I might make additional changes, but that's the beauty about being able to edit in Photoshop or edit in Lightroom, is that everything's non-destructive. We can make additional changes as needed. All right. However, down in this lower right-hand corner here, we go from, if we travel top to bottom, left to right, okay, we go from whites to shadows to midtones. All right, so it goes light, dark, middle. All right, I would rather have something a little bit darker there because I don't want the eye traveling to that corner and then out of my frame. That would not make any sense to me. I would rather have something there that kind of bounces the eye back up into the middle of the frame. All right. Any questions on my train of thought here so far? We good? Everybody follows that? Okay. All right. So that's my road plan. That's my road plan. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it first in Lightroom, and then I'll show you how to do it in Photoshop. All right. And the reason I do this is because I want you to see some of the power that is available just by working in Lightroom. Can you tell I'm a big fan of Lightroom? Okay. So the first thing we want to tackle is that sky. All right. So these are all going to be local adjustments. Okay. All right. For those of you who do not know what local adjustments means, global adjustments are an adjustment that applies across the board to everything in the image. A local adjustment targets only a very specific part. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to target that sky, and we come over here. All right, to our mask tool, and you can see that we have subject, we have sky, and we have background. All right, so we're just going to click on the sky, and it's going to build this nice mask of the sky. And we know that the sky is in our highlights range. Or, oh no, I'm sorry, in our whites range. Okay, so I'm going to take the whites and I'm going to pull it down. Okay, and you can see that it's really not doing too much. All right, so I'm going to take and I'm going to bring my highlights down, and now, oh, there we go. Now we're starting to get a little bit of sky coming forth. Okay. All right, and this here illustrates the power of why you should shoot in RAW. Always shoot in RAW. Because when you first saw the image, you say, oh, wow, there's like no detail there. But there actually is detail that we're pulling out, because the dynamic range of a RAW file far exceeds the JPEG preview that is available to us. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're pulling some of that detail out of the sky. And if you look at it now, it looks kind of funky. It looks weird, because the slightly darker sky now looks out of whack with the luminosity of the trees. All right, so we need to find a balance of where it looks natural, but yet we still have some of that detail. So what I'm going to do is, we noticed that earlier when I moved my whites slider, it barely did anything. It wasn't until I brought my highlights down that we started seeing some of that detail. All right, so what does that tell you? It tells you that all that detail that's there was crushed all the way at the far end, all the way to the white. And when I brought the whites down, it moved it, but it still kept it in the whites section. It wasn't until we moved to the adjacent zone that we were able to pull it into that zone. All right, so obviously I don't want to push it back into the whites, and the slider that would do that is our highlights, because the highlights slider is what brought it into view. If I move that slider, it's not going to bring it out of view. Make sense? All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over to the adjacent zone, which is our whites, and I'm going to manipulate that and bring it back to see if I can find a nice balance. All right, so you can see as I bring it back, we're brightening that sky, so now it balances with our tree line, yet we are maintaining all that detail in the clouds. Okay? And this is where we just kind of, we need to understand what the tool does in order for us to really, be able to apply it effectively. Okay. All right. So that pretty much, for now, takes care of our sky. So we have our first mask, which is our sky, and I'm going to go ahead and label it sky. All right. So as we add more masks, we can keep track of what's what. All right, so that's our sky mask. Okay. The next one, I want to create some kind of, excuse me one second. I want to create some kind of demarcation or delineation of the far bank with the near bank. All right, so where in the physical space, where is it? And it's literally right here, because we understand that these bushes and coming up to these trees are on this side of the bank, and these trees here are on the far side of the bank. All right, so this is going to be our line of demarcation. Within that line of demarcation, all right, we're going to disregard the sky. Disregard the sky. We've already taken care of the sky. Now we're going to start working down. All right, we have the tree line in the far bank, and we have the trestle that goes across from one bank to the other. But because it's on the other side of these bushes, we're going to consider it as part of the far bank. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to bring the exposure up a little bit, because what I want to see is 3 steps. All right, and the 3 steps is where we have our lights, our midtones, and our shadows for that 3-tone composition. Okay. Now, this is an oversimplification, because once we do this and you look at it, you're going to see that, yes, there are shadows in our midtones. There are highlights in our midtones. Likewise, there will be midtones in our shadow areas, just like there might be some midtones in our lights. Okay, but what we want to do is we want to work in chunks and blocks. Okay, and then I'm gonna if you don't know it, I'm also going to teach you a nifty little trick. All right, so let's take a look. All right, so now I need to create a mask for this area. Well, unfortunately, there's no easy way of building a mask. So we're just going to click create new mask, and I'm just going to brush it in. Right, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go fairly big size. I'm going to go with about a 50% feather, and my flow is going to be 100%. And I'm going to turn my auto mask off. Okay, auto mask, all right, is off, and we'll be turning it on, but for now we're going to keep it off, and I'll tell you why. As I start painting, okay, you'll notice that, of course, I have my color right here is set to that god-awful purple color, because it contrasts nicely against all that green. So now I can see my mask, okay? And if you notice, I'm keeping away from the edge of that tree line, because I don't want to get any of that sky in my mask. All right, and now this area here, this area right here, is actually a building on the road behind those trees that are receiving a lot of sun, so they are very bright. I don't want that competing with the sky, so I'm going to make the choice right now to also darken that part. Okay, I want to darken that part. All right, so I can do one of 2 things. Oops, wrong. There we. Oh, wrong button. All right, I'm just going to avoid it. All right, because what I want to do is I want to take all these shadow tones and darker tones, and I want to brighten them up. All right, so if I paint that little section of the building, it will also brighten it up. So I want to avoid that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just up to that embankment, and I have a fairly decent coverage. Okay, like I said, I stayed away from all these tree lines because you can see we actually have sky peeking through the branches. All right, so how do we deal with that? If I go ahead and paint there, you notice that it's going to paint onto the sky as well, and that's not what I want. All right, so we're going to go ahead and apply an auto mask. All right, this little check mark right here, click that. And what auto mask does is it uses Adobe AI to figure out where the borders are. And the way it works is you need to start painting on what it is you want to mask. And when it comes across a border that doesn't match what you initially started painting on, it's not going to apply the mask. All right. So obviously my brush is a little bit too large, so I'm going to go ahead and reduce it. I'm just using the square bracket. I'm going to reduce it down to a manageable size. I'm going to start on the green part of the tree, and I'm going to very carefully go up into these areas. I'm going to be careful that I don't cross over into the sky area too much, because then the AI is going to say, oh, you want to include that sky too, which is not what I want. All right, so I'm going to very carefully just mask all the way here. All right, and if you can see, it's doing a fairly decent job. Oops. See, I went a little bit too far there. It's doing a fairly decent job of masking those areas. All right, and take your time with it. All right, there's no need, to rush. The quality of your edit is only as good as the quality of your mask. Let me back that up a little bit. If you need to resize down to a smaller size, go ahead and do that. Okay. All right, so this part against the sky was fairly easy because there is a pretty wide contrast range between the tree line and the skyline. All right, now we need to go down here where the vegetation kind of bumps up against the water line. All right, there we have to be a little bit more careful. If it crosses over, it's not too bad. All right, in these areas, I tend to increase my feather. So I'm going to bring that up to 100%, because that way it allows me to use the feathered edge to kind of cross into those edges. And because it's a feathered edge, it's going to be a little bit on the softer side, and it's a little bit more forgiving along those edges. All right, and just like that, within a couple of minutes, of course I'm doing a lot of talking, but within a couple of minutes we got a very decent mask. All right, so what do we want to do with our midtones and our shadows and our darks in this section? We want to raise them up. We want to get a little bit closer to our sky. Not a lot, just a little bit. Okay, so which slider do we tackle? Well, at this point, we can pretty much take an educated guess and go with our shadows. All right, because the reason being is it's crossing three different zones. It's in our midtones, it's in our shadows, and it's in our blacks. So I'm going to pick the middle one, and it's going to push the midtones and it's going to pull the blacks. Okay, and because this is working non-destructively, if that doesn't work, I can always undo it. Okay, now one thing about shifting sliders as you edit, I often suggest that you go to an extreme and pull back rather than inch up, inch up, inch up. Because as you inch up, your eye kind of gets used to that and says, okay, did I go enough? Did I go enough? Did I go enough? Did I go enough? All right. And our eye kind of gets used to everything. And before we know, all right, we turn away, we go grab something to drink, we go to the bathroom, we come back and go, oh my God, that looks horrendous. All right. It's because our eye kind of gets used to these small steps. So what I normally suggest is, let me bring that back to 0, is take a leap all the way to the end and then just start bringing it back until it looks proper. And right about there, there you go. That looks fairly decent. That looks fairly decent. Okay. And now, let me make that mask. That's going to be trestle. Is it TSEL or SLE? I can't remember. Laugh at me if my spelling's wrong. Okay. All right. That's looking a little bit better because now we have a division between each segment. Okay. Finally, we have this section here, which is shadow, and then we have this section here, which is midtones. And what we want to do is, we go light, medium, dark, and then back to medium. All right, our eye wants to keep going. We want to be able to bring the eye back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken this section here. Okay. And this one, I don't need to paint. I can actually use one of our tools. So I'm going to create a new mask, a linear gradient. I'm going to match the angle of my gradient to the angle of that section there, which, creates that nice little triangle. Okay. And we're going to take our exposure, which is our midtones, and we're going to darken them down a little bit. Okay. We can even see if the shadows do. Oh yeah. Pulling down on the shadows actually makes it look, gives it a little bit of richer look to it. And now we have a balance. Okay. All right. So now we're looking at it, it says, oh, wow. We have this whole section of sky and far bank that now looks a little bit too bright in relation to everything else. Okay, let me just corner. Okay. All right. Looks a little bit uneven. All right, so we're going to go back to our trestle mask. All right, and we push the shadows up. So maybe, let's keep the shadows there. Let's bring our blacks down. See if we can balance that up. Maybe our exposure down just a touch and just keep the shadows, open the shadows. All right. So at this point, it becomes slight experimentations. This is what I call salt and pepper to taste. You're going to make adjustments that look good to your eye. You are the photographer. You are the artist. It needs to look good to you. All right. And it's very subjective. It doesn't, All right. And then, of course, the sky, that's still looking pretty darn good. All right. We're going to go ahead and close that out and maybe just add a slight punch up on our exposure. That looks pretty good. We're still maintaining that detail in the sky without it being too dark. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a little bit of warmth. Add a little bit of warmth. So I'm taking my temperature and I'm moving it to the yellow side, away from the blue. All right. And that looks pretty darn good. Okay. Now, this side here, in comparison to here, looks a little bit warmer. All right. If that, a little bit hotter, light-wise, luminosity-wise, if that's the case, we can create another mask. We do a nice linear gradient, and we can take and we can push our highlights down and see if we can even that out a little bit more. Okay. Finally, the last thing that I like to do, all right, we'll call this, if I can double click on the label here. Why isn't it? There we go. All right, we'll call it balance. All right. And then the last thing I like to do is I like to ground the image by adding a little bit of a darkening on the bottom. All right. Some people will add a vignette. Typically, I don't like adding vignettes to landscapes because it looks a little bit too fake. I reserve vignettes for like studio shots, portraits, things like that. But for this, I'll just add another linear gradient coming up from the bottom. Oh, coming up, there we go. Lock it in, and I'm just going to pull my exposure down just a tiny bit. Okay, and what's it's doing is it's darkening that foreground edge and pushing our view back into the frame, further into the frame where our subject is. All right, and we can call it grounder, for lack of anything. Okay, and we'll call that quits. All right, so here's the before, here's the after, before, after. Hopefully you see that, you know, it makes for a little bit clearer composition. Our eye isn't being drawn to that path as much. It's there. We can still explore it, but it's not pulling our eye completely out of our frame. Okay, any questions so far with anything that I've done here?
Yes, I have a question.
Go for it, Brian.
When you were first starting, I was holding off this question because I thought you might be working into your talk, but I was thinking that you might have isolated the trestle. But when you masked it, you had all the trees around it. Yeah, and I was thinking, because what I liked when you first turned that on, you know, the trees were kind of blown out, but I liked the way the trestle was really sticking, was really prominent. So I was wondering now, if you were going to do that, could you just do another mask on top of that one, or would your approach be different?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Let's go to the trestle one. All right, so for that trestle mask, yes. But my goal when I originally laid out my roadmap, my initial goal was to also bring up the exposure of the trestle. Okay. But as I said, and thank you for bringing this up, because what I said is my edit is very subjective. It's to my vision. You may have a different vision and it's perfect. You say, hey, you know, I would rather see that trestle a little bit darker. Okay. So now this is where we can experiment a little bit. It says, okay, so that initial mask that I made, that I labeled trestle, actually crosses 3 zones. It goes from our midtones, which is near the top of the trees there, all the way down into our darks, which is the deeper shadows, not only within the trestle, but underneath the trestle and the deeper parts of the trees. So we are spanning 3 different zones. And because of that, what I said is we're going to pick the middle zone and push that middle zone, because it's going to push the midtones and pull the blacks along with it. Okay, so understanding that, we can go back to that same mask, which is our trestle, and we can say, okay, we brought up our shadows, okay, and we can see that here. All right, but I also backed down on our blacks in order to create a little bit more contrast in the deeper shadows of the trestle. We can take that black and pull it down a little bit more, and just like that, we're adding a little bit of contrast to the tree line, okay? Which now it's bringing it closer to our foreground, but it's making that trestle now pop forward, okay? So you may say, all right, the texture of all that green around it is kind of a little bit more regular, but now the trestle stands forward, okay? If you say, well, you know, I don't want to lose that definition between the far bank and the near bank, so let's bring that back, all right? So obviously pulling the blacks down is not going to do it. Let's see if we put our shadows back in the middle and we take our exposure up, all right? Probably just a tiny bit, all right? Will that make the difference? It says, no, it's kind of looking a little bit kind of gross, all right? So that might not be the solution, all right? So we played around with it and it says, well, you know, as much as I would like to get away with it, I think we're going to need to make another mask, which is fine, okay? So we create a new mask. More than likely, it's going to be a brush. We take and we brush our trestle in, okay? Actually, let me back that up. I'm going to make sure, create new, brush. Oh yeah, make sure that auto mask is on. So as I brush that, I'm going to keep it as close to everything that is that dark color, all right, and let the Adobe AI kind of make sure that it catches my edges, okay? All right, now, what I want you to notice is I have auto mask on, and I don't know if you can see it. Let me see if I can zoom in. Notice that there's holidays in the mask, all right, because it saw that hard contrast between the greenery and the background, and it says, I'm not going to mask that, okay? So for that, I am going to go ahead and take auto mask off, and I'm just going to clean those little sections up manually, okay? And now at this point, what we can do is we can take our shadows and bring it down a little bit. And then if we want to add some contrast, you know, with the deeper shadows, I'm going to bring my blacks down. Okay, and just like that, we have a more dominant train trestle. Okay, salt and pepper to taste, but that's a awesome observation. All right, so here's before, here's after.
So with these Lightroom things here that we're working with, do they have layers, or in this case, like, because before your trestle mask had included the trestle mask included the trestle, right?
Yeah.
You treated the trestle, and then you made the one that was just the trestle.
Yep. All right. So
you have to go back and erase from another one, or does one overweigh the other? Or what you did with your tools takes into account what's on the other.
Well, the labels are arbitrary, you know. So now that I created an actual trestle mask, I'll go ahead and rename that to the far trees, and the new one I'll rename that trestle.
But so the one that's called far trees now, is the trestle still part of that mask?
It is part of that, yes. Yes. All right. Just because that's the way I initially built it. Okay. Now, the nice thing is because we are working non-destructively, I can, in effect, what I've done is with that initial mask is I added light to the trees and the trestle. But as you said, you know, I kind of want that trestle looking a little bit darker. So with the next mask, I am removing light. So I'm basically undoing what that previous mask did. Okay. But because it's working non-destructively, it's doing the math before it applies anything. All right. So it says, okay, well, we're adding X amount of light to this part, but in the next mask, we are removing X amount. All right. So if we do the math, it actually works out where we're only adding a tiny little bit. All right. And that's what it's going to do. It's not like it adds, all right, and it applies that and it says, okay, now we got to remove it, and it applies that, because if we do that kind of manipulation, eventually the pixels go all kablooey and gross looking, and we lose all kinds of saturation and contrast. So it does that, all that math beforehand, and then applies it. Okay. I don't know if that explained it to you properly.
Well, what I was wondering about is I was doing something similar to this, and the situation was I had a person and a background, and then I picked an object which was actually part of the background. And so then I was wondering, well, should I go back into the background and then take out the object that I added the other mask, you know, because the Lightroom can differentiate between the person I picked in the background,
Right.
but not so much the other one. And so I was trying to think in my head, do I need to do that, or what would be the difference of doing that? Or
yeah, you'd have to weigh it on a per image basis when a problem like that occurs, because you may look at it and says, you know what, it's really not that noticeable, I'm just going to leave it as is. Or you can say, wow, that really, you know, accents that. So that's where you have to go to the individual mask and say, okay, well, it added that effect here because it also selected. Let me go in and modify that mask and make a subtraction to that mask.
you know, what I was doing was, well, I was working with some. I was doing cleanup work, if you will, or playing around with it. So the background was really funky, and I was just trying to get it in the background, but there was something in that that I wanted to bring forward. So I thought that's why I thought that I would want to get rid of that, because the other stuff might compete with it.
Right, right. Okay. Yeah,
Thank you.
601 half dozen the other, really. All right. All right. I'm just going to try and see if we can, just for shits and giggles, I'm going to experiment just a little bit more and see if, yeah, that doesn't do very much, does it? Okay. All right. So as you can see, that we can really push our image a lot in just by using the local adjustments in Lightroom. All right. And you might say this is good enough. Okay. But today's class is Photoshop. So what we're going to do is we're going to replicate all of this in Photoshop. All right. Now we can cheat, and we can go and open up our image in Adobe Camera Raw and do exactly what I just did in Adobe Camera Raw. All right. But it doesn't make any sense. I'll just be duplicating the same exact lesson. All right. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and go to...
Can I ask a question before you jump off to
Yeah.
the Photoshop with this one? If this were a this was high end, you're getting paid money to fix this photo up to look as good as it can.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have done? I know you would have started in Lightroom, but would you have at some point go, well, I know I could do this in Lightroom, but I can do it better in Photoshop. And so, would you have maybe
Ooh,
taken the
good
chance
question. Yeah, good
to know
question.
the fact?
Yeah, so uh all right. That question actually broaches another problem with this image. All right. And that is the fact is this image is a lousy image to consider for a high-end client. All right. The reason being is the contrast level between our sky and foreground is too much. Okay, I have to.
Well, let me ask it another way then. You know, this is a kind of a not a very good image, but you got to produce because someone's got a gun to your head. So I know I got to make this look as good as I can. So when I start out in Lightroom, and now I know I really can do it, but now I want to go to Photoshop because I can really, get destructive.
Right, right.
Or,
Um, yeah, I mean, if push comes to shove, I might take a look at some things that I can do in Photoshop. But again, if it comes to the point where you're producing artwork for pay, hopefully you'll take a little bit more care in producing better quality images. Okay. This particular image was done during a photo walk. So it's not like I spent a lot of time analyzing this. I just kind of like, oh, this looks pretty. I'll shoot it. See if I can make something of it later. That's not the way I would approach a paid client. I would approach a paid client with a little bit more care. And at this point, for a paid client, I would probably do multiple exposures and do an exposure blend, where what that means is I'll shoot for a properly exposed sky. I'll shoot for a properly exposed tree line, and I'll shoot for a properly exposed shadow detail. All right. And a lot of people consider this HDR, but it's a little bit more finesse than HDR. It's actually exposure blending, and that will allow me the ultimate amount of control. All right. Now, that being said, all right, you're under the gun. All right. You kind of walked away and you're kicking yourself in the ass because you didn't do your due diligence, but you still have to produce. All right. So the only thing you can do is produce to the best quality that is available in the image that you shot. That's all that you can hope for. All right. And you have to understand that it's going to present a few problem issues. All right. And that is masking the sky. Because what happens is that no mask is going to be 100% good. All right, you're going to get some haloing around the mask edge, where as you bring the exposure of the tree line down, actually, you know what? Let's just go ahead and start doing it, and you'll probably see what I mean. Okay, so like I said, one of the problems is, as we bring the exposure of our sky down, if we don't have a good mask, we're also going to bring the exposure of the edge of our mask that encroaches into the trees. We're going to bring that exposure down, and we're going to get an edge around the trees that is darker than the tree line. So we have to be careful of how we do that. All right, so now let's go into the workflow for working in Photoshop. And it starts off the same exact way as when we started with Lightroom. We start by first analyzing what our problem areas are and then building that map to go forward. All right. The only difference between the Lightroom and the Photoshop workflows is that our tools are now different. The underlying foundation of what those tools do are the same. We're manipulating exposure, but how we get there is the difference. Instead of operating sliders, we are now going to create layers with layer adjustments. Okay, and those layer adjustments are going to have a mask applied to them in order to apply those adjustments locally. Does that make sense? Hopefully, yes. Okay. All right, so now the key issue here is building a decent mask for our sky. So if we were to zoom in, all right, we can see that the sky is a little bit blown out. All right, so what we're getting is, it's called light bloom. Light bloom. Light bloom is where light kind of wraps around a subject and kind of hides or encroaches on the edge definition and renders it a little bit brighter, so we lose that edge. Okay, and we some people call it frying the edges. Okay, and we can see that here along the edges of the trees. All right, we see all those individual little leaves that create the tree, that the light is really wrapped around it. And what we're seeing is, we're not really seeing the leaves themselves. We're just seeing this kind of like middle block of shape that's left over from the light wrapping around. So it looks a little bit on the fried side. Okay. So now we have to be careful how we mask that, because we don't want to go too far away from that edge that if we bring the sky down, it leaves a white halo around everything. We also don't want to go in too far into the tree, into the leaves, where it leaves a dark edge around the leaves. So it's going to be a little bit of a balancing act. Okay. So how can we do this? All right. In this case, what I want to do is I want to try to build as best a mask as I possibly can. All right. And as with anything with Photoshop, there are several ways of doing it. All right. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my background. All right. Control J or Command J will make a copy. All right. That way, in case I accidentally do anything to that, I can, I have my original. As a matter of fact, my original should be locked. Okay. From here, I can go to our select, all right, up here, select color range, all right, or I can do select sky. All right, so let's do select sky, see what happens. It's gonna use the Adobe AI, and it's gonna make a selection. All right, you can see the marching ants. And we can say, okay, now that we have a selection, let's make an adjustment. All right, so what do I want to do is I want to bring that sky level from white into our highlight. So I want to lower the exposure. All right, we can do that a couple of ways. We can create a curves adjustment or we can create a levels adjustment. All right. Now, most of you know one of my favorite tools is the curves adjustment because you can do a lot with this. But in this case, the curves adjustment is like taking a fine crafted precision tool to do, very delicate work. In this case, I don't need that delicate work. I need more of a brute force hammer. So in this case, I'm just going to select the levels adjustment. And as soon as I click on my levels adjustment, all right, it's going to build a mask. Okay. But what I want you to look at is the histogram. Okay. The histogram here. It's pushed all the way to the right. We have this big spike here all the way in the whites. And then trailing underneath that is this kind of like trail off of everything else. All right. Now this is only showcasing what's within our mask. So all that represents literally the edge where the tree line is. Okay. What I want to do is I want to take our mid-tone slider, all right, and I'm going to basically bring, this represents our midtones, our 50% gray, all right, and our 50% gray, like you see here, it's at the 50% mark of our histogram, right? We have 50% on this side and 50% on this side, right? We want to move it so that 50% is now close to that spike. And as I bring it closer to that spike, you're going to notice that that sky darkens down. Okay?
Hey, Doug.
Yeah.
Whoops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go. Screen went dark. That seems to be doing the opposite that you would normally think of. It seems to me, if I wanted to, and I say it worked. It seems to me that if I wanted to make the mid-range darker, I would want to move it to the left to make it darker, right? Why did it work this way?
Okay. All right. So you have to understand what we're doing here is what we're doing. Let me bring this back to the middle. Okay. In the levels adjustment, we have 3 controls. All right. We have our darks, we have our midtones, and we have our let's simplify it. We have blacks. All right. All right. It's pushed all the way to the left. All right. This is black, 100% black. Okay. And then we travel through the shadows to our 50% midtone. Okay. And we travel through our lights to our white point. Okay. Our white point. So this is 100% white. This is 100% black on the opposite side. This is our 50-50. All right. So from here is we have darks, and here we have lights. Right? Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. As I move the slider towards the light, this side is going to get dark. Oops.
Oh,
And this side is going to remain light.
I see.
All right. So we're taking the dark side of the force is encroaching onto what is normally light. All right. So it's often referred to as zone placement. Okay. So we're telling, basically what I want to do is I want to say, okay, this section here is our sky. All right. But it's crushed all the way into the whites. Okay. If we were to magnify this, I want, all right, so let me see if I can draw it here. All right, let's say that is our corner, okay? I want to tell Photoshop, okay, that spike, which is all the way in the right, I want to remap it so that this side of the spike is now in our midtones, all right? And this side here remains in our whites, okay? That's all we're doing. We're remapping it. So our midtone is way over here, 50%, all right? So that means I gotta now push it all the way to here. All right, and now our midtones are going to start at this end of that spike. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So that's literally all that this slider is doing. And this is what I mean by taking a blunt force tool to do just this very simple task. Okay. Now, as you can see, we've decreased the contrast that we had along that tree line. All right. So that makes that tree line now look a little funky. All right. And you can see it if I click off. It looks very burnt. All right. Let me zoom in. All right. And you can see how there's like dark edges.
Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't look very good. All right. So we need to kind of fix that. All right. We can do it a couple of ways. One way we can try is if we double click on our mask, it's going to pull up our mask selection tool. Okay. And we have a slider here that allows us to feather that edge. All right, because right now it built a pretty hard contrast edge. You can see everything that's red here. All right, it's following that tree line. So if we feather that out, I'm about 6 pixels out. All right, what's going to happen is it's going to encroach into our mask, and it's going to make that edge even darker. All right, because we're shrinking that. All right, so what we can do is we can shift that edge, all right, outward a little bit. All right, so now one slider kind of made it a feather, so there's a softer transition. It's not a hard edge transition. The other brought it from inside our selection further out. And this is where you have to kind of be careful, because if you go too far, or if your adjustments are too broad, you're going to get a halo, because our edge, our mask edge, is now out here. It's soft, but it's now out here. All right, so we have to be aware of that. Now, one of the things that we have available to us is the contrast slider, which allows us to shift the contrast of that edge and basically reduce the amount of feathering a little bit more. Okay, so we can contrast that down. All right, and now we're just getting a little bit of some of these errant little tips that are dark, but overall the rest of it has cleaned up quite a bit. Okay, so we're gonna go with this for now. I'm gonna hit OK. All right, and you can see now that edge where the trees looked a little bit funky and a little bit out of sync with our background now matches the back. Oh, what happened? I lost. I lost. Damn it. Let me Photoshop. Let me get rid of all of these masks. Okay, I got to reopen this in Photoshop. Edit in Adobe Photoshop. Photoshop shut down on me. Didn't like what I was doing. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, there we go. Oh, good. It kept it. All right. All right, let's zoom back in. Okay. You can see that it actually did a really nice job of cleaning up that edge. All those dark, kind of unmatching color is now all really, really cleaned up. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. No, it didn't. It didn't keep it. Oh, shoot. Oh, wait a minute. Here it is. All right. Let's close that. It's right here. There we go. There we go. See? All right. Now, obviously, there are little areas that, you know, just look kind of weird. We have these little sections that kind of float. All right. But in the whole spectrum of things, is it that critical? All right. Is it going to create that much of a problem? Probably not. Okay. All right. So let's zoom out. All right. So now we have our first mask. All right. We're going to go ahead and drop that down. Oh, okay. I see what it did. It really backed me up. All right. Let's go back to our feather, contrast, shift our edge. All right. See if we can zoom in. All right. Feather, shift, add a little bit more contrast. Okay, there we go. All right, and here we see we have our halo. All right, this is what I was looking for. All right, I was gonna say that came out a little bit too good. Now I understand why I wasn't applying it at all. All right. So this now becomes our view. Okay. So we can do a couple of things. All right. We can play around with this, or we can see if we can find a different method of creating a mask. Okay. So let's put this on hold for 1 second. Okay. Another way we can create a mask is we can say, all right, I'm going to create a curves adjustment, and I want to see if I can create a contrast between our foreground and our background. All right. And if you notice, what I'm doing here is I just created a curves adjustment. And again, just kind of like what we did with our levels, what I'm doing is I'm going to say, all right, here is our black point. I want to move my black point to the midtones. Okay, so here's our 50% mark. Okay, I've now remapped it so that all of this is black. Okay, that's all I did. All right, and what that's doing is it's creating a heavy contrast between our sky and our foreground. Okay, so now I can take that. All right, let me close that up. I can see if I can use this to create a mask. All right. So if I press and hold Control key or the Command Control Option key for you Mac people and click. All right. Oh, let's see. Click here. No. No, it's not going to do it. All right. Go select. All right. Let's go with color range. All right. We can do sky. All right. But I'm going to go color range because I want to show you a different method. All right. What I want to do is I'm going to click on the top and I'm going to click where it says highlights. Highlights. Okay. And we have two sliders. All right. We have the fuzziness slider. All right. And we have the range. Okay. And the range is the one we're going to go for first. And if we look, the range has that bar that goes from black to white. All right. And grace in the middle. All right. So just like everything else, all right, this is black. Here is our midtones, 50%. All right. And here's our whites. Okay. We have this whole area here, which is black. And we have this area up here, which is our whites. All right. And I purposely used the levels adjustment to create a major difference between the two. All right. So now watch what happens when I take this slider and it says, all right, I want to create the division and I want to select only the area of the image that sits within this part of that range. Okay, so I brought the slider over, all right, and it's now selecting everything that is light colored, all right, into the whites. All right. And the fuzziness is kind of like our edge transition. How much of the transition from, if we draw a line here, all right, this is what's being selected. This is what's not being selected. How much of a transition do we cover here? All right, so we go from 100%, 50% to 0%. How much of that transition are we going to capture? Okay, that's going to be our fuzziness. All right. So now we have this section here, which we can say, do we want to darken that up or do we want to not touch it? It says, well, yeah, you know what? Previously, I do want to darken it down. So maybe I want to include it. So if we look at our mask, it's hard to see because it is so small, but there's a little bit of white showing up. As we move to fuzziness, we see that we are now including a little bit more. All right. If we bring it up, we're going to see now we are including, again, hopefully you guys can see it. Down here, we have this part, which is very bright. That's being picked up. And we have this section here, which are the little white flowers that are also being picked up. Okay. So that fuzziness is how much of a range from that pure white that we want to get in on. All right. The nice thing is we're going to be building a mask so we can edit this. So I'm going to be, you know what, at this point, about 60% works for me. I'm going to say, okay, it's going to make a selection. All right. And I'm going to now create a new curves adjustment, okay? And I'm going to take that curves adjustment that I did to darken down. I don't need that anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. All right, wait, no. Make sure that you have the curves adjustment, not the mask, before you delete. All right, delete, say yes. Okay. All right, so now we have a mask. All right, and if we hit the Alt or Option key for you Mac people, Alt, click on the mask, it's going to show us the mask. And you can see how it has selected the building in the background. It selected the highlights on the water. It selected the flowers on the bush. Okay. I don't want a lot of that, so I'm going to get a brush. Give myself a nice large brush. Make sure that black is my foreground color, and I'm just going to paint on all those things that we don't want included. All right, because we're going to lower the exposure. I don't want to lower the exposure on the flowers or the highlights on the whatchamacallit, the highlights on the water. All right. Now make sure that your adjustment layer is selected, not the mask. Okay. And we are going to lower our exposure. Okay. And what are you going to notice here? All right. What do you notice? Okay. You're going to notice something similar that happened with our levels adjustment. Okay. You notice that our curve flattened out here and it's coming up here. All right. What did we have when we did that levels adjustment? The same exact thing. Okay. So let's reset that. What we can do now is we can take our black point. Okay. So this is the difference. What I said earlier about the difference between the levels adjustment and the curves adjustment. The curves allows you to really fine tune your manipulation. I can place points anywhere along this line and manipulate it anywhere along that line in any way I want. Okay. With the levels adjustment, you only have 3 points. All right, so let me reset that back to default. We have in levels adjustment, if you recall, actually, let me go to the levels adjustment. We have our black point, we have our middle point, which is usually here, and then we have our white point. We have 3 points, okay? Here we have multiple points, but down on the bottom, you'll see we have this point here and this point here, okay? These are our black points and our white points, okay? If we take that black point and we bring it over, all right, towards this way, it's going to make all these pixels here darker, all right? And again, recall, this spike right here is what we are contending with. That's our sky. So if we blow it up, all right, we see that it creates a spike like this, all right? We want our black point to be here, or actually our midpoint. We want our midpoint to be here and our white point to be here, okay? So that stays pretty much the same. So we just take this black point and we bring it over. All right, and you're going to look at that sky and you're going to notice that we are now darkening our sky. All right, and now at some point we can even make a little point and we can create a kind of like a little bit of a curve. All right, and we have to be careful because what we have now is we're getting that fringing around our trees. We have to be careful. All right, so maybe I want to bring it out a little bit.